Welcome everybody to today's ECPS in-house webinars. My name is Dr. Zehra Çolak. So we decided to start this series as a group of scholars and academics from a diverse range of disciplinary backgrounds to improve our understanding and knowledge about issues intersecting with populism, but also to kind of contribute to the facilitation of a critical dialogue among scholars and academics working on populism from different perspectives. So we are also going to be recording this webinar right now, and we are hoping to reach out to a wider public who are interested in these pressing issues. Today we are welcoming Katy Brown and Dr. Aurelien Mondon. So Katy Brown is a final year PhD student at the University of Bath, whose research focuses on the mainstreaming of the far right in Europe. Her thesis aims to theorize mainstreaming and analyze the role of elite discourse in this process using the Brexit referendum as a case study. She has published an article in Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power on far-right opposition party accession to the EU, and along with Dr. Aurelien Mondon, a paper on the Guardian's use of populism, which they'll be presenting today. Dr. Aurelien Mondon is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. His research focuses predominantly on the impact of racism and populism on liberal democracies and the mainstreaming of far-right politics through elite discourse. His first book, The Mainstreaming of the Extreme Right in France and Australia, A Populist Hegemony, was published in 2013, and he recently co-edited after Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech, published with Z. His new book, Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream, co-written with Aaron Winter, is now out with Verso. So the title of their talk today is talking about the far right, the role of populism in the process of mainstreaming. And this is how we're going to be proceeding. Katy and Aurelien will be presenting their work for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A session for about 20 minutes, perhaps 30 minutes if there's a lot of discussion and if they have time, of course. So feel free to use the chat function to share your reflections and questions throughout the presentation. Otherwise, you can also use the raise hand function. And without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Katy and Aurelien.
Hi everyone, thank you Zehra for inviting us here to talk today about the use of populism and its role in the process of mainstreaming. So this presentation is a bit of a combination between a paper that Aurelien and I worked on about the Guardian's use of populism, and then a wider discussion of the need for critical approaches to populism, particularly in terms of the mainstreaming of the far right. So we're looking forward to discussing these ideas with you in the Q&A session. Just to go through then a plan for the presentation. First, we're going to talk a bit about the process of mainstreaming, how we understand it and why it's important to consider in this context. Next, we'll discuss the populist hype, what this looks like and some of the recent literature around it. We'll then go through the findings of our case study on The Guardian before finally considering the importance of thinking carefully about our use of populism and how we refer to the far right. So let's start with mainstreaming then now.
So the term mainstreaming is something that has been fairly well talked about in the literature, but very rarely defined. And in fact, I mean, I have been guilty in my own work of not defining it very carefully. And so what we've tried to do with Katy and with Aaron Winter, with whom I co-wrote the book Reactionary Democracy, where we talked about mainstreaming a bit more, is to come up with a more precise definition. And this is something we're hoping will be published very soon. So if you're interested, let us know and we will pass it on when it is published, hopefully in the next few weeks or months. And so what we mean by mainstreaming is the process by which parties or actors, discourses and or attitudes move from marginal positions on the political spectrum or public sphere to more central ones, shifting what is deemed to be acceptable or legitimate in political, media and public circles and contexts. So what we mean is that what is mainstream at a certain point in time doesn't have to be mainstream in the future and didn't have to be mainstream in the past. The mainstream is not something that is fixed. It's not necessarily something that is good. It's something that is contingent, that moves according to political struggles, political ideas, and politics more generally. crucially, what we highlight, that's particularly crucial for our presentation today, is how mainstreaming is a dual process, which involves the far right, of course, which might change its discourse, might change its attitudes towards elections, and so on and so forth. But it also involves mainstream actors, such as the media, politicians, and academics, and the way they talk to, about, and with the far right.
Sorry. Okay, so within mainstreaming, and particularly the discourse of mainstream actors, there are two interrelated aspects that we are interested in looking at. So which we can call talking with or talking about the far right. So talking with means the way that actors may express similar ideas to the far right. So when exploring this aspect, we look at shared discourses between them, which can lend salience and legitimacy to far-right ideas. Talking about is how actors refer to far-right groups and construct them discursively. So this is in relation to how the far-right is defined and labelled and what kinds of ideas this evokes about them. Critically, the way that we talk about the far right is not separate from a process of talking with. So our choice of words and definitions to describe such parties, actors, and/or ideas influences our understanding of them. So as we'll discuss in depth in a moment, when we refer to a party as populist, this is not simply a neutral and descriptive term. It has normative implications which we must consider and address. Most people, whether that be in the media or academia, for instance, would acknowledge their role in talking about the far right, but there is limited engagement with how certain choices in this can also talk with. So for this reason, we need to consider the relationship between talking with and about the far right and centralize these ideas when we decide how to talk about the far right. So why do we need to do so, and particularly in reference to populism here? So we've seen recently that many far-right actors have embraced the term populism. In Nigel Farage's final speech to the European Parliament, he spoke of the great benefits of populism. Matteo Salvini in Italy wore a t-shirt at a rally in 2018 that said, "I am a populist" on the front. Steve Bannon, in an interview for The Guardian, also stated that he was a populist. And Marine Le Pen in 2013 said, "If it means a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, well, then I am a populist." So we need to think about why they are doing this. Why does it suit them? And what effect does it have when we label these parties populist? So these are the types of things that we need to consider when we're talking about the far right. And this speaks to the broader role and responsibility we have in these matters. So we'll now look a bit more closely at populism and the populist hype.
So before we turn to populist hype, I mean, it is of course important to remember that populism is not just a word that is used by the populists to describe themselves, but it's also a word that has come to define our political age. Wherever you look nowadays, you see the word populism used by populists themselves, but also by people trying to define populism, populist attitudes, and so on. It's splashed across the headlines, brandished as in political speeches and commentaries, and applied extensively in numerous academic publications and conferences, as you can see on this graph. Searching the Web of Science revealed that the number of publications containing populists, so P-O-P-U-L-I-S, and then so populism, populist, populist, and so on, in the title, abstract, or keywords, has risen sharply, as you can see, from 310 between 1970 and 79 to 1,498 between 2000 and 2009, and 6,482 between 2010 and 2019. So you can see a huge rise in academia in the use of the term populism in the title, abstract, or keywords. In some of these articles, populism is actually not used in the body of the articles. It is just used in the title because it is a term that has been used to define a lot of things, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. So in this context, what we argue is that we must interrogate whether it is these parties alone who have had a serious impact on our democracies, or whether it is the way they are discussed, platformed, and engaged with by mainstream elite actors that facilitates this success. And B, whether what matters is the parties themselves or the proliferation of their ideas, and in this case, whether we should look beyond electoral politics to ensure that their defeat is real rather than the result of an absorption of their discourse and policies by the mainstream.
So to build a bit more on this then, one of the ideas that I'm sure you'll have read about in political discussion, in the news, in academic literature, is that we are living in a populist moment, experiencing a populist wave. And I'm not going to talk about the rise of populism as a societal phenomenon here, but rather the rise of the use of populism as a signifier. So we've certainly seen a populist wave, but perhaps not the one that is so widely spoken about. So as Aurelien already mentioned, in academic literature, we've seen the number of articles published rise hugely over recent years. So the first figure, 2009, is from 2009 to 2014, and the second is from 2015 to 2020, the number of articles that were published with it in the title, abstract, or keywords. If you also look at newspapers and the media, there is a very similar trend. So between 2009 and 14, 1,474 newspaper articles were published in the UK that contained populist in the title. In the same period following that, so 2015 to 2020, that figure more than quadrupled to 6,922. This means that for both of these groups, this averages at more than 3 articles per day in between 2015 and 2020. So some may argue that this is reflective of the populist moment or wave, but we need to reflect seriously on our role in constituting it and feeding into the hype.
And this is what we have tried to kind of develop with Katy and some other colleagues, starting with Jason Glinos and myself in 2016, a concept that we call the populist hype, which is how we talk about populism. The populist hype, of course, is not about, it's not saying that we shouldn't worry about the far right, for example, and parties like the Front National, UKIP, and various others across Europe and the West who have been called populist. We should worry about them. We should worry about their level of support, but we need to look at them critically. So what is the populist hype? First, what we argue is that the rise of right-wing populism is a hyped symptom of a broader crisis that takes the form of political alienation and dissatisfaction, and usually a rise in abstention, a rise of inequalities, and a failure of liberal democracies to live up to their expectations. We argue that there are 3 dimensions of populist hype. One is the exaggeration of the results, usually ignoring, for example, high abstention in certain elections, such as the EU elections. And we could think of the case of the EU 2014 election here. 2, the exaggeration of a political role attributed to right-wing populist parties and movements by implying they are the main alternative to the status quo. Here you could think about the country Katy and I live in, the UK, where a tiny party in terms of vote, UKIP, managed to impose the Brexit vote onto all of us in the end. In 2014, the European elections, UKIP was the only party that wanted to get out of the EU. They won the EU elections, but with a massive abstention, which meant that they only got 1 out of 10 registered vote in that election, and yet they imposed the whole kind of Brexit debate and eventually the referendum and the UK leaving the EU. And finally, a tendency to describe the rise of right-wing populism in apocalyptic tones that signal a threat to democracy as such. So let me give you an example now, if we move to the next slide, Katy. The Front National and the populist hype. So the Front National, Rassemblement National in France. Some of you might remember in 2002, these are kind of headlines and front pages in 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the far-right extreme-right party Front National, reached the 2nd round of the presidential elections. And you can see the headlines here. The shock, a big no. The bomb, Le Pen, no, and with his face crossed. The danger, the earthquake, the shock. So you can see here the kind of cataclysmic, catastrophic headlines of the Front National getting to the second round. This was actually the first time I ever voted in my life, so it was quite a shock for me as well, of course, and a lot of French people feared that fascism was at the gate, what was already started to be called populism, wrongly according to us. What we totally missed in France at that stage is that actually the problem wasn't the Front National. Katy, if we can move to the next. So this is the results of the Front National according to percent of the vote from 1974, when the party was founded, to 2017, the last major elections in France. P is for presidential elections, E is for European elections, L is for parliamentarian elections, legislative. What you can see is actually when you look from 0 to 100, there is not a massive rise, and there's certainly not a massive rise from 1988 to 1995 to 2002, when we have the bomb, the shock, the earthquake. You can see that actually there's some stagnation. If you look at registered voters, what has just appeared, the kind of light green on your screen here, this is when you take into account abstention. And if you look at 1988, 1995 and 2002, the major elections in France, the presidential elections, the Front National actually stagnates. So even though in 2002, the Front National reaches the second round, it has not grown in terms of registered votes. What has happened is that the mainstream parties in France, the center-right, the center-left, and the center totally collapse. There is a massive political dissatisfaction towards the mainstream. And what happens is the vote is scattered, there's a massive abstention. And what we should have talked about in 2002 was that abstention, that political dissatisfaction. Instead, what we talked about was the Front National. And we talked about it for years and years. We had then Nicolas Sarkozy, who mainstreamed the Front National more. If we can click, Katy, for the next image. We also talked about the Front National and the new leader of the Front National, Marine Le Pen, as the party of the workers, which again was problematic, and we don't have the time to go into this, but we can talk about it if you want in the Q&A. And finally, what we got to today in 2021, if we can click again, yeah, it's this, which is Marine Le Pen debating on primetime television the Home Office minister in France, Gérald Darmanin, who is part of the Macron government, and Darmanin saying to Marine Le Pen, who is famously Islamophobic, who has been whipping up Islamophobia in France for years and years and years, to the point that it's incredibly mainstream, Darmanin telling Marine Le Pen that she is too soft on Islam. And Marine Le Pen looking shocked at the fact that she is so mainstream now that the Home Office minister of a so-called centrist party is actually more extreme than she is. And again, remember, this started in 2002, when actually her father's party was stagnating. And that completely derailed the discourse. So that's what we're going to look at now a bit differently.
Okay, so that example and many others highlight the need for more critical approaches to populism. And there are a number of excellent studies, and I've put a few of them on the slide here, and a growing field that explore the effects of the use of populism and its definition. So this includes work on the populist hype, the populist signifier, anti-populism, and critiques of the ideational approach to populism, which has dominated in the field. So these works highlight the need to explore beyond populism as a phenomenon itself, to investigate the logics that are pushed by labeling certain things as populist or not, hyping them, and how this can shape our understanding of those aspects of politics. And as a result, we need to consider the role of populism as a signifier and the implications of its use. This brings us then now to our case study of the Guardian and its use of populism. And I'll quickly explain the methodology and choice of case now, before we then go through the findings in more detail. So we adopted a mixed methods approach to discourse analysis, combining discourse theory, critical discourse studies, and corpus linguistics. These three are not often amalgamated as one, but their respective strengths mean that they can be combined to form a cohesive whole. And I'll not go through in much detail, but I'll give a little flavour of why they work together. So discourse theory allows us to focus on the wider level and explore the logics of discourse, developing our findings into broader theory. So here we were looking at the implications of the use of populism as a signifier in The Guardian. Then critical discourse studies looks at how discourse helps to sustain social and political inequalities, with a practical focus on analysing real-world examples. So for instance, here we're looking at The Guardian and its role in mainstreaming. And corpus linguistics, which uses computerized techniques, allows us to work with larger volumes of data, and there were lots of articles here, which I'll come on to in a moment. And you can also probe particular words in depth. So we could look at the context of the use of populism. So each of these approaches allows us to deal with certain aspects of the study, so that they can be combined into a coherent research programme. We chose to look at The Guardian for a number of reasons. So first of all, The Guardian launched a 6-month series on populism in 2018. So this gave us a clear timeline and editorial focus. We extended this for a further 6 months to see whether these trends continued. Also, the liberal centre-left approach of The Guardian as a newspaper means that through its coverage of populism and the far right, it's not pushing something its editorial line consciously and openly supports. So it's interesting for agenda setting, as Aurelien will discuss in a moment. Over the course of a year, from the 20th of November 2018, which was the launch of the Populism series, 1,548 distinct articles were published containing populists, so populism, populists, etc. This averaged at 132 per month, or 4 per day. And there were 3,996 individual users of populism in the corpus. So we were interested in exploring the topics that populism coincided with and the context of how the concept was used in these articles before considering the potential effects this had and forming a critique. So moving on now to the findings of that study.
So the first two findings that we found were agenda setting and deflection. I'll start with agenda setting. Agenda setting is a concept that was mostly developed by Maxwell McCombs over the years, which really goes, which tells us really that the media does not tell the public what to think, but it can certainly influence what the public thinks about. To quote McCombs, journalists focus our attention and influence our perception of what are the most important issues of the day. So the media does not tell you what to think, but it tells you what to think about. This is something, of course, that is important in democracies where we have to understand our societies. And the only way to understand our societies as a whole is to have some mediated knowledge, which can be, of course, from the media, but can be through other things such as religion, trade unions, work, family, and so on and so forth. But today, the media plays a major role, and in the UK in particular. This can take place through two particular processes, priming and framing. By priming certain issues over others, in our case, populism over other issues such as racism, for example, we argue that The Guardian drew attention to the populist element at the expense of others. We talked about populism instead of talking about racism, for example, or nativism, or xenophobia, or even sexism. It does not mean that the audience necessarily started liking or disliking populists, or even necessarily agreed with the editorial line of the newspaper, but simply that it occupied a certain amount of space, as well as a particular position in what is a finite and hierarchized ability to consume news and analysis. Framing here reflects the editorial choices made to center the audience's attention on the populist attribute of certain political actors and ideas, rather than on alternative signifiers such as racist, socialist, far right, far left. What you can see here in the image that you have in front of you is this was one of the kind of launching articles of the series, and you can see the title, "Why is Populism Suddenly All the Rage?" and the subtitle, "In 1998, about 300 Guardian articles mentioned populism. In 2016, 2000 did. What happened?" We found this absolutely fascinating, this kind of first article. First, why is populism suddenly all the rage? And in the series, The Guardian never explores its own responsibility in putting populism on the front page. And the subheadline is fascinating again here. You know, what happened? Again, The Guardian does not reflect on the fact that it is an editorial choice to put populism in articles on the front page rather than, say, racism or something else altogether, inequalities, poverty, and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to say here is that there is a lack of accountability and reflection. If the newspapers turned to populism, it was assumed without any self-reflection that it was because A, populist parties and politics were on the rise, B, that their readership wanted to read about populism, and C, that the coverage had no impact on populist parties and politics and their potential rise and fall, as if reporting on populism had no impact in and of itself. While basic media studies, of course, would suggest that editorial choices firmly rest with editorial boards rather than with the public themselves, and that the power to set the agenda also remains within such spheres, The Guardian acted as if it were an objective and removed actor whose practice could not be subject to a critical appraisal as if removed from power relationships. This denial of agency allowed the series to pretend to be an objective survey of a political phenomenon, as if the journalists, the academics and political actors who developed it were not embedded in power structures with considerable influence over the development of public discourse. Closely linked to this, we identify a process of deflection deriving from the use of populism as a descriptor with implications in terms of agency and ideas. Like agenda setting denial, the term and focus on populism has commonly been used to deflect attention away from the responsibility of elite actors, instead pinning the blame on certain sections of the population, and notably the working class. Deflection around such topics is further entrenched through the association of populism with illiberalism or opposition to the status quo. And you can see here Steve Bannon being called a populist, while Steve Bannon is in fact very much a white supremacist or an extreme right thinker, politician, if you want to call him that way. This was, if we can click again, Katy, this was also massively legitimized by certain academics who were lending their voice to actually mainstreaming this idea that it was about populism rather than about racism or the far right.
So the second key effect that we identify is euphemization and trivialization. And this refers to the overuse of populism, either to replace more accurate and stigmatizing qualifiers or to describe a wide range of unrelated phenomena which devalue its meaning. So first of all, to start with euphemization. In the articles, there was a seeming reluctance to use terms such as racism, nativism, or even far right. And the result of this avoidance is that the real politics behind these reactionary movements and ideologies is concealed under less clear, politicized and stigmatizing qualifiers. For instance, when the far-right AfD finished second in local elections in Thuringia, they were labelled anti-immigrant populists. So the choice of a nomination strategy of populists here places this as the core feature of the ideology and centralizes populism over more accurate descriptions of their politics. Other examples of euphemization included referring to Boris Johnson as a burqa-bashing populist, the decision to strip Shamima Begum of British citizenship as populist, or referring to assassinated Dutch far-right politician Pim Fortuyn as a flamboyant populist. So despite clear racism, these acts or people are referred to instead as populist, and this is foregrounded. And it's dangerous because the common association between populism and popular support, as Aurelien just discussed, lends greater legitimacy to such ideas and figures. And then now moving on to trivialization. In the articles, populist is used to describe a vast array of phenomena and is itself described in a huge variety of ways. So beyond politics itself, populism is attributed to things as diverse as theatre, football, health fears over vehicle exhaust emissions, art, Facebook, and even the film Sweet Home Alabama. And those are just some of the examples that we could have chosen from. In one article, it is used to describe a jazz musician as a fervent jazz populist, with no other mention of the term and no explanation as to what the word referred to. Another musician is referred to as being in a sweet spot between Ed Sheeran populists and the indie faithful. Indeed, in the 1,548 articles, 1,037, so more than 2/3 of them, only contained one reference to populists. So through this sprinkling of populism, its meaning often goes unexplained. Furthermore, the way that the concept itself is described also has a trivializing effect. The word cloud on the slide includes all the preceding adjectives or adverbs moderating populace, and these are sized according to their frequency. So you can see the huge range of words and that cover numerous themes related to position on the political spectrum, geographical location, negative qualities, etc. There's a huge contrast in how it is described. It can be at once rancid, progressive, and even fluffy. The problem is that this heterogeneity and carelessness in its application, combined with this common association with the far right, can make these types of parties seem banal and harmless. If anything and everything can be populist, then why should we worry about the far right? So euphemization and trivialization are a potent combination. While on the one hand, populism is being associated with deeply harmful exclusionary politics, it is also treated playfully in some cases and applied to a wide variety of phenomena and described in these huge array of ways. So as we've seen, the term has been welcomed by far-right actors, and it can facilitate the far-right's pursuit of a reconstructed and destigmatized image.
In addition to this, we argue also that The Guardian has participated in the amplification of the far right, thus giving them further credence as well as the necessary space to be heard. Across the whole corpus we looked at, there were more than 1,500 words deriving from the lemma rise, almost one occurrence per article. So usually when we talked about populism in The Guardian, it was talked about as something that was rising. Although its context varies, this focus on rising waves is prominent in reference to populism within the data, with the rise of constituting the most frequent cluster around the populist concordance. If we look more precisely at the slide here that you have in front of you, this was the second day of the series. On the second day of the series, The Guardian dedicated, so the new populism series, dedicated no fewer than 4 articles to Steve Bannon. You may remember Steve Bannon. He was a former advisor to Donald Trump. He played a key role in in the campaign of Donald Trump in 2016 and in kind of linking him to white supremacist movement in the United States. By the time The Guardian series came out, Steve Bannon had been kicked out of the White House and he had absolutely no power anymore. He was trying to come to Europe to start new movements, but it was already failing. And yet The Guardian decided to dedicate no fewer than 4 articles on the second day of its new populism series to someone who is not so much a populist as a white supremacist. To give you a bit more detail on these articles, to show you the problems with the use of populism and the amplification of populism here, to talk about someone who really should not have been given that platform. An editorial that was published on that day stated alarmingly and yet equivocally, and I quote, "Europe watches in alarm as Steve Bannon, a Trump ally, attempts to mobilize a hard-right network in next year's European parliamentary elections. His campaign is faltering, but there is no doubting the threat Mr. Bannon poses." So here you have this kind of headline that says, he's a danger, he's a Trump ally, but really he's not anymore. He's mobilizing the hard right, but we're calling him a populist. He's a real danger, but actually it's faltering, but it's still a threat. So you have like contradictions within a few sentences. And the 4 articles play on the same contradictions. One of them is giving him a platform through an interview, and you can see that's the second one. "I want to drive a stake through Brussels vampire." Why would you give someone whose campaign is completely faltering a platform to express his ideas on a center-left newspaper? The articles were filled with inconsistencies like the one I talked about. One is titled "The Mayfair Dinner That Brought Europe's Far Right Together," which you can see, that's the third one. In fact, the article tells us that Steve Bannon kicked off his grand project with a sumptuous spread in Brown's Hotel, but indigestion soon set in. So in fact, it was not a big dinner bringing the far right together. It was a massive failure. And yet the headline, which is what most people will read, not going into the article, tells us that it was quite successful. And this goes on again. For example, in another article, which was 2,600 words long, which is a very long article for a newspaper like The Guardian, which is the Steve Bannon, I want to drive a stake through Brussels. Bannon is given a platform, an uncritical platform, to expose his ideas and talk about his plans to forge a new populist supergroup in Europe. Again, this is contradicted further on in the article, where it is said, I quote, Bannon's plan is colliding with the realities of European politics, where right-wing populist parties have turned down his approaches, and electoral laws that mean he is barred or restricted from campaigning in most of the countries he wants to intervene in. So we have 4 articles about Steve Bannon at a stage where he is already irrelevant and failing in Europe. Far-right parties in Europe do not really want to engage with him. The laws in Europe prevent him from engaging the way he wants to. And history and hindsight have proven that what we already knew at that stage, Steve Bannon's European enterprise was a failure. And yet, even though we knew that, The Guardian dedicated a ton of paper or website to them. So we're going to move on then to really what are the 2 core aspects to all of this, which is legitimization and mainstreaming.
Yeah, so through the case study, we argue that the populist hype has facilitated a process of legitimization for the far right. So with coverage of far-right politics euphemized and amplified, and its origins deflected onto the people or working class, we've witnessed a move towards accepting the diagnosis offered by the far right, not only as inevitable, but also democratic. One of the most prominent examples of this comes in an article that involves Hillary Clinton. And so Clinton's advice to the centre-left to stop this amplified and euphemized threat, and you can see the amplification and euphemization in the title, was to accept their ideas rather than to develop different narratives. And this example epitomizes the processes that we've highlighted and the dangerous effect that they can have. In particular, how talking about the far right can feed into a harmful process of talking with it. The Guardian case study highlights some of the main issues and dangers deriving from an uncritical use of populism, notably agenda setting and deflection, euphemization and trivialization, and amplification. We're not arguing for the complete withdrawal of the term, but rather for more critical, contextualized, and careful use. It's important to stress at this point that The Guardian is by no means an outlier in this misuse, and the new populism series did include some extremely useful articles on the topic, but that this is merely representative of a wider issue. And this brings us then to the conclusion of our talk, and a consideration of the ethics of talking about the far right in certain ways. What we've tried to show is that the way we talk about the far right can have important effects for its normalization, legitimization, and mainstreaming, and thereby talk with them to some extent too. The huge wave that we've seen in the use of populism as a descriptor has important consequences which we should not ignore. In whatever capacity, whether as academics or journalists, etc., we need to reflect carefully on the choices that we make when we talk about certain phenomena. As Emmy Eklund states here, we must consider the structural patterns produced by our definitions and the way that we use words. Through exposing these detrimental effects in the Guardian case study, we hope to contribute towards a more critical and thoughtful use of populism in the media and in public discourse more generally. This means that we must centralize an ethics of talking about in our understanding of the far right and mainstreaming, particularly its relationship with talking with, in order to develop a consciousness of the role our words can play in this process.
And so to conclude, we've made a set of recommendations, really, which we hope will engage you and lead to a fruitful discussion in the Q&A. The first one is that it is not just about populism, but it is how we talk about populism as academics, as journalists or as politicians. It's not just about populism, it's more than that. And therefore, we've come up with 5 rules for talking more critically about populism. The first one is that there is no such a thing as a populist party. There are populist far-right parties, populist left-wing parties, populist nationalist party, and so on. But there is no such thing as simply a populist party, because there's such a difference between populist parties that it is not particularly helpful. We need to also ask ourselves a series of questions. The first one is populism a simple descriptor, or is it an insult, or is it a compliment? Do we actually use it to add to the discussion, or do we use it to discard an opponent, or do we use it to prop up someone, a party, or some politics? The second question is, what impact do I have when I use populism instead of far right, for example, or populism instead of far left? Does that help these parties? Does that hide their nasty side? Does that hide their racism, for example? Third question, is populism the best term to talk about Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and so on and so forth? Or should we use more precise terms such as far right, racist, nativist, authoritarian potentially? And finally, am I being simply an anti-populist? And what does that say as well about this? Because again, populism can mean a lot of different things. And quite often populism is simply the creation of a people versus an elite, which can be very negative when it's the far right, but it can also be more positive when it's, for example, something that is aimed to bring people together against an authoritarian regime. So all of these kind of questions we feel are absolutely essential with the way we talk about populism, particularly in Europe and in North America, as it can lead to kind of legitimization of a very, very dangerous authoritarian ideas, even against our will, if we don't talk about this carefully. And we'll leave it here. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much for this very insightful and interesting talk. We also have some journalists in the audience, so I'm sure they're going to have some reflections on that, talking about how it is very challenging for the journalists to tackle these issues. Do we already have some questions, or perhaps I might already start the discussion with a reflection of my own regarding those different categories and the distinctions between them? I mean, as you said with Marine Le Pen talking about, how she was kind of addressed by the minister that she was too soft on Islam. So just makes me think, if all these far-right ideas are moving into mainstream, why is it still important to talk in different categories? Why is it still important to distinguish between far-right, extreme right? Because they are, being normalized. So how can we, there is a blurring of the categories as far as I understand from here. So do you want to perhaps start by reflecting on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you're right, because we're seeing like these borders between say the mainstream and far right as well. We're seeing that they're blurry, but there's this idea that they're static, and part of it is in discourse through talking about the far right in certain ways. There's an idea that the mainstream is static and moderate and good, but we're seeing that also there's a lot of blurriness between the discourses, a lot of shared discourses. So we need to interrogate these categories and look at what's happening there to sort of disguise perhaps the blurriness of the boundaries.
If I can maybe just add to this as well. I mean, it's in the French case, it's particularly clear what Katy was mentioning here, this blurring of boundaries. For a very long time, the Front National was seen as the kind of extreme kind of enemy. All the parties used to kind of gather against the far right and the Front National and the Le Pens because they were terrible. But they were also used as a diversion away from the problems of the mainstream. And so mainstream politicians used to be like, oh, they're terrible, but we'll steal some of their ideas still. And we've got to a point now where the boundaries are so blurred that it's hard to know actually who's far right and who isn't. And I mean, if you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to watch that debate, or part of the debate at least. And you should see the face of Marine Le Pen when she's told by the minister that she's too soft on Islam, and she says, "But hold on, I'm not against Islam. I'm against extreme Islamism." And even if, of course, her argument is racist, couched in kind of cultural racism, she was kind of shocked at the race, like the obvious racism of a counterpart who is supposed to be mainstream. And so, as Katy said, we need to challenge the idea of the mainstream as necessarily good and a bulwark against the far right as well, because these ideas, they shift, they move, and they can quickly come into the mainstream.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I can ask a few questions if it's possible.
Please go
So yeah, my name is Erdem. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in Canada. I have a couple of questions. I think your article makes excellent points in terms of your findings, in euphemization, deflection of the responsibility, amplification of the support of these populist parties. I mean, my first question is that then how do we explain the connection between structural causes of populism and the abuse of these causes by some parties in a populist way? Because I understand populism is a style of doing politics, right? Rather than a kind of strict adjective that we can use for a political party. It's a way of doing politics. So how do we explain what is the best way of explaining the abuse of those structural factors which are objectively there, right? In the case of, Europe, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, that divide between national sovereignty and EU supremacy, supranational institutions. So how do we explain the connection, right, between the structural factors and the abuse of these factors? And the second question, so you take these mainstreaming of far-right parties as a huge side effect of the overuse or uncritical use of the term populism. Is this, I understand that you take post-structuralist discourse analysis, but is this the impact that you measure in the English language media? Would you see any difference according to national context? For example, is there a similar level of mainstreaming of far-right politics in Germany as opposed to the case in UK and France? These are the questions. Thanks.
Katy, do you want to take them or should I? Or
You go for it.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for your questions. I mean, they're very interesting and they're huge as well. So I don't know how long you have, but I think we'll just scratch the surface here. The structural causes of populism. I think it's a fascinating question, and I think there's a lot of them. And I think the important thing is not to simplify it. And I think the problem is populism and the misuse of the concept of populism as really simplified the way we look at the many crises Western and European democracies are facing at the moment, but the world as well. And in a way, it's acted as a deflection away from this crisis. And that's why we used as an example the Front National in France in 2002. In 2002, the French people and the French kind of discourse should have been around what is happening with our mainstream politics. Why are people switching off? Why do we have a record number of abstention? Why are people not voting for the parties who have been leading them since the Second World War, pretty much in various shapes and forms and under various names? Why are they turning off, turning away? Something that is, very similar to other democracies, Western democracies in particular. And instead, what we did is we looked at populism, and we looked at populism through the eyes of the far right. The same thing pretty much happened in 2016 in the United States when Donald Trump is elected. We talk about a populist wave. We talk about Donald Trump, flying to the White House on that kind of massive populist wave, and is pushed by the white working class, which is upset, blah, blah, blah. All of this is actually a misreading of what happened. The first thing, which is, I think, absolutely damning for US democracy, is that Donald Trump is elected by 1 out of 4 registered voters by 1 out of 4 voters in the United States, registered voters in the United States. There's a turnout of about 50% at that stage, right? So 3 out of 4 US voters did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016. And in fact, about the same amount voted for Hillary Clinton. And in fact, a few more voted for Hillary Clinton when it comes to actually head counts. But the way the system works meant that Donald Trump was pushed through. The other thing about the working class as well is that, again, this is a complete misreading of the situation. Donald Trump's electorate is very similar to George W. Bush. It's a Republican electorate. It's a very wealthy electorate. And in fact, it got even wealthier in 2020. So it is not a working class revolt. And the working class hasn't turned to Donald Trump. They've turned away, they switched off, they abstained. Same in France and the same in other countries. However, that leads me to your second question, which is the contextual one. And the contextual one is extremely important. Of course, today, what we talked about was mostly about the UK, a little bit about France, and it applies in different ways. For example, if you look at France, laïcité, secularism plays a particular role in the way Islamophobia has become mainstream, very different to the UK. If you talk about the US, it's again a little bit different, and about in Germany, different as well. However, I think we can safely say that populism has been misused in a number of places in a way to kind of euphemize, I mean, what we've been talking about, euphemize, amplify, and so on and so forth. And I mean, to us, what really, gets to us in a way and makes us do our research is the fact that we are not talking about what we should be talking about, and instead we're talking about populism, which deflects attention away from the crisis we are facing and the solutions we should be putting in place.
Yeah, and just to add, on the slide about mainstreaming, we put the definition that we provided in our article that will hopefully be out soon. And the idea with that article is to try and come up with a framework for understanding mainstreaming, but with the idea that we do need to take into consideration the particular context that it comes up in. So hoping to engage with others and find out, and see whether the framework needs to be modified, etc., in light of different contexts as well.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think Dylan has a question. Please go ahead, Dylan.
Joanna was before me, so go to her first.
Okay, right, I've reactivate my video. Thanks. That was an extremely interesting talk. Thanks very much, Aurelien and Katy. I'd quite like to just first of all note that we've been doing some comparative work around the way that populism is talked about on a between 4 different countries, which, as you maybe know, with Mats Ekström and Mariana Patrona. So we have been looking at how populism is talked about, and we did a study of just 2017 in 4 different nations and how many editorials there were. First of all, I'd just like to say that we also found that The Guardian had massively more articles about populism than the others in the corpus, so of all the papers we looked at. But we also did a comparison between the kind of more, so let's say, centre-left newspapers, one from each country, and the more right-wing newspapers. So we also looked at the Telegraph. We looked at Le Monde et Le Figaro in France. And we found a huge similarity between the metaphors. You were talking about the different ways in which populism is talked about in The Guardian. We actually found that was shared across different national contexts. We were finding the same ways of talking about populism. And one of the things that was really quite prominent was the fact that it is quite often conceptualized as a disease. And it is something that has to be inoculated against, and you can vaccinate the population against it. And we found this idea everywhere in Sweden, in Greece, in France, and in the UK. And I just wondered if you had come across that in your research, that it seems like it's something that the population has to be cured of. And very much in the context of the Telegraph, they were, in 2017, they were saying that Theresa May had cured the British public of populism. Populism had gone away, and there is no more populism in the UK. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, if you found any of those kinds of references, that it seems to be, I mean, particularly in the current context of pandemic, and this was 2017, but it's something that you can, that it's a disease and it has some nasty manifestations, but that you can inoculate people against it. So that's my question. Did you find that kind of talking about populism in your data in 2018, which is obviously a later time in this Guardian series?
Thanks. Yeah, that's so interesting, and definitely would be interested in reading about that from your work. I think I would need to go back to our data to have a look. There's certainly, as we were talking about this idea of the rise and the spread, which has some similarities to the idea of an infection or disease. I think like it reflects the sort of deflection as well, because if you're portraying it as a disease that's spreading, you're putting it very much as a sort of bottom-up process of its growth, and that it's uncontrolled by elites again. So it's pointing to the problem is over there, and we're the good ones who are trying to do something about it. So yeah, I think it speaks a lot to the kinds of results that we found, and it would be interesting to have a look back at our data in light of what your findings are.
Yeah, we also used a corpus-based approach when we did that particular study, so it'd be very interesting to compare the two. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we should definitely compare notes, because that's fascinating. I don't recall much about diseases, but we did see very similar trends as well, and part of populist hype as well looks at these kind of things. I mean, when you were talking about the disease and the cure, it kind of made me think about Nigel Farage talking about how he cured the UK of the extreme right. And actually, as a populist, bringing in populism, he kind of resolved the kind of extreme right problem of the BNP. So there was this kind of weird thing happening here. But one of the things that we looked at with Jason Glinos in particular, when we tried to conceptualize populist hype, was the concept of theft of enjoyment, which I think is very present in a lot of mainstream media and broadsheets in particular, like the Telegraph, Le Monde, the Guardian, and various others, when they talk about populism, which is the idea of a theft of enjoyment, how someone is stealing our enjoyment of liberal democracy. If only we didn't have Trump voters, if only we didn't have Marine Le Pen supporters, if only we didn't have Brexit voters, we would have, a nice democracy. But of course, this is not how it works, right? Because there's not such a thing as a very well-defined Trump voter, and so on and so forth. It cuts across class, across gender and education, and so on and so forth. But this idea of like, it is here somewhere, and if only we could inoculate it, if only, I mean, I've never seen, like, I haven't paid attention in terms of disease, but yeah, it really resonates with this kind of idea of theft of enjoyment. So yeah, it'd be great to compare notes at some stage.
We will, yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Dylan. I think you're next.
Yes, sorry, I'll spotlight myself. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful talk, and I was interested in how populism is kind of a floating signifier that takes on different meanings in different contexts. My question, I suppose, is methodological, because it seems to me that you need to have a basic conceptual understanding of what populism is before you start to think about it in a discursive sense. You need to decide what topics to study, what sources, what newspapers to look at. And you can't look at anything, at everything in any given project. There are always space constraints, time constraints, financial constraints, etc. The French situation is really interesting, I think, because on the one hand, you've got Le Pen, but in some meaningful conceptual sense as well, Macron is sort of a populist. He disrupted the prevailing two-party system. He now courts some far-right votes using this anti-immigration rhetoric, despite having come from a socialist government under Hollande. Obviously, he's not as dangerous, but in some meaningful conceptual sense, he's also a populist, and he's pejoratively described like that in a number of right-wing media outlets, even as Le Pen herself describes herself as a populist. So I'm interested, I suppose, in what we describe, what we choose to discuss as populism within academia also has a performative effect, and confronting the kinds of people that you are confronting at the moment should be a priority. But how do you balance that recognition of your own performativity with the need to be thorough in the way that you conduct an academic survey? Sorry, that was a slightly long question, but I hope I didn't stump you.
I mean, I'm happy to start with the Macron part if you want, and then Katy can talk more about the methodology one, as she really is the expert. Well, the Macron one is an interesting one, and I think, it speaks to how populism is used and misused, and the kind of the role it's playing, the logics behind it nowadays, really, in our politics, because the fact that people want to be called populist and politicians want to be called populist is fascinating. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, the fact that Emmanuel Macron can posit himself against an elite is, to me, absolutely mind-blowing, right? In 2017, Macron had nothing that was anti-elitist about him. He was the elite, he was the establishment. But at the same time, Marine Le Pen had become the establishment in 2017, and that's where it backfired for her in the presidential election, where she was hoping to be faced with François Hollande, with Nicolas Sarkozy, two former presidents, and then she ends up being faced with Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the left, with François Fillon, who is a bit of a broke kind of right-wing, candidate, and Emmanuel Macron. And the Parti Socialiste is completely destroyed. And so she becomes the establishment because she's the only one who's ever run a presidential campaign, pretty much. And that was quite interesting to see that play out. And that's where I think, Macron kind of got the better of her in the second, in the campaign between the first and second round. Not that there was no way she would have won then. I think the mathematics were quite clear, but he made her look terrible because she had to go back to being extreme if she wanted to look different, as opposed to being the establishment. So I think it's fascinating, and it speaks to this moment we live in, where there's this deep distrust of mainstream politics. And we can see it in many, many different kind of countries and different settings where, look at social democrat parties that are crumbling all over the place. Even center-right parties are moving more and more rightwards. And trying to appear more and more kind of irrational. Look at the Conservative Party in the UK, for example, and the way they've handled Brexit in a way that, conservatives would have thought was completely mad 10, 15 years ago only. The idea of leaving the kind of the union, the market, the way they kind of, dealt a blow to business. And I think that's fascinating here, I think. And there's this kind of panic mode almost. That you can see in the Macron government, I think, in France, that's taking place. And this idea of populism, and again, you can see how this idea of populism has kind of gripped our societies and our politics, where we think that actually we need to talk to Marine Le Pen and to Marine Le Pen supporters, as opposed to talking to people who abstain, or as opposed to talking to people who actually vote for you. And, you can see that on the left as well. I mean, the Labour Party in the UK at the moment is trying to talk to the kind of so-called white working class that has turned to the Tories and to UKIP, instead of talking to the working class that is very diverse, that is very much sold to Labour, to social progressive policies, and so on and so forth. I think it's fascinating. I think it's suicidal for that party as well, but somehow they seem to buy into that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think dealing with this methodologically is so important, and one of the things that I've been working on at the minute as well is actually a study that follows similar lines, but of academic articles that contain populists. So from that Web of Science database. So I've done some initial analysis using corpus techniques as well. And again, I think within academia, you can see some of the effects that we talked about, like euphemization, trivialization, coming into lots of academic studies too. So in a need to balance this performativity, I think we as academics need to look carefully at how we are using populism as well, because again, it's used to cover a lot of different aspects. There's a lot of focus on so-called populist attitudes based on the ideational approach. So it's calling for more reflexivity, basically, because we've seen this huge wave of articles about it. And again, there's elements of trivialization, a common association with the far right, but not always as well. So I think it's something that as academics we also need to look into, as well as journalists and politicians.
Final questions from Lance?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much for this great presentation. My name is Bülent Keneş. I'm a professional journalist, but also have some academic studies. I wonder about what do you think about the possibility of mainstreaming, how that you talked about may have a possible effect for taming populist far right or extreme right, especially while they are in opposition. Taming effect. What's your reflections about that?
You were talking about framing, sorry.
Taming.
Taming.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I see what you mean, and I think we've noticed a change historically in the far right, where they've what some of us have called discursive reconstruction, when, you know, the extreme right has moved away from kind of biological racism and obvious forms of violent extremism and racism towards more cultural forms of racism. We could see that as a taming effect, because, you know, these parties have moved from violent opposition to accepting certain rules of liberal democracy, such as elections and, you know, the rule of law and things like that. But I tend to be a bit cynical about these things from my research, and see this more as a thin veneer applied over the same old policies in many ways, you know. And for example, what used to be, you know, if you take the case of France, what used to be anti-Arab sentiment, which was very close to biological racism, became Islamophobia. Why? Not because the party was less racist, but it was easier for the party to target Muslim people because it was a religion, even though they were targeting it in a racialized manner, than to target Arabs as they used to, you know, under Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 70s and 80s. So this is why we call it discursive reconstruction, as opposed to taming, if you want, or to a real change. That can happen, and, you know, maybe it is better to have, you know, this kind of less obvious new cultural racism than the kind of violent racism. But at the same time, I think it also allows the mainstreaming process to take place more quickly, because you can see then, you know, someone like the minister in France in the Macron government, you know, being actually more obviously racist than Marine Le Pen, who has become very clever at it and managed to kind of make her ideas enter the mainstream that way, while it would have never entered the mainstream in its extreme form, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I
think as well, like, there's an idea around the taming of the far right, if as a view of success, that if the far right don't get votes electorally, then it's been a success in stopping the mainstreaming of the far right. But I think that's why we also need to look at mainstreaming discursively as well, because even if the far right aren't in government, but the mainstream party has been normalizing their ideas, then still a form of mainstreaming has taken place, perhaps not electorally, but their ideas might be brought to the foreground. So I think we always need to be careful around sort of these ideas of a strategy around it, because it can lend to this discursive normalization that is harder to pinpoint than, oh, they've got into government. So yeah, we need to be careful around strategic ideas for this.
Well, thank you so much. We have well exceeded the 20 minutes Q&A session, but if you have time just to close the discussion, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about how a center or a think tank such as ours can contribute in a constructive and meaningful way to this highly polarized and complex issue. Do you have any thoughts on that, other than, you know, being critical and thoughtful about the terminology that we adopt when we are discussing these issues? Do you have any other suggestions?
So it's a tough question, but I guess it's really just to reiterate what we've been saying as well, in that when you're using populism in the think tank and in your publications, in presentations and things like that, thinking about whether populism is what you're talking about in that instance, or is there another term that you are actually talking about, really. So it's working towards a precision and reflexivity on it, really.
Yeah, I think Katy is spot on. I mean, at the end of the day, it's also about asking ourselves difficult questions, you know, whether as a think tank or as academics. I think it's, you know, it's the process of reflection, of sometimes, you know, realizing that maybe we should have used another term, maybe we should have done this and that, you know, and it doesn't matter, you know, and I think that's one of the things we don't see anymore so much in our fields and in the media in particular, but also in academia, I think, in a way, is people kind of digging in a way, as opposed to actually, you know, admitting. And, you know, I used to use some certain terms, but I don't use anymore, and I've moved on from certain terms. And, you know, that's what research is about. That's what I think politics is about. That's what looking at politics for a think tank or for the media should be about. Yeah, I think the reflexivity is important, and just thinking about our practice and what the impact our practice has. But I think it's great to have a you know, a think tank like yours to actually be open to having people like us who may come from a more kind of critical approach. But I mean, you know, we are on the same side at the end of the day, right? It's about kind of making sure that we kind of all work together and try better our understanding of movements that are incredibly dangerous for all of us and for democracy, really.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent conversation and presentation and sharing your work with us on a Saturday evening. I think not many people would accept that, so we are really grateful for this. And we will have our next webinar on 16th of March with Dr. Mariana Patrona, Mats Ekström, and Joanna Tornborough, who was actually here. They will be also talking about the framing of the right-wing populist discourses in the news media across France, Greece, and Sweden. So I think it will be a great way to continue this conversation on how the news media is actually normalizing this far-right discourses beyond UK. So thanks so much once again, and looking forward to seeing more of your work in the future. Have a nice evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone.